Hello everybody, in this topic we're going to talk about tissues. So epithelial tissues, connective tissue, muscle tissue and nervous tissue. But this recording is just going to be about epithelial tissue. We have key objectives for this topic and they involve being able to list the four major adult tissue types and list the distinguishing features of each. We're going to talk about how the four major tissue types are subclassified and be able to list the major functions of the tissues and relate their structural features to their functions. But this recording is just about epithelial tissue. A little bit of background on tissues to begin with. Tissues consist of cells and extracellular matrix, or extracellular material surrounding them. So the extracellular material is still inside the organs, but it's outside of the cells. And tissue classifications are based on the cell structure and function and the composition of this extracellular material. Four main tissue types, as I mentioned. We're going to talk about epithelial tissue here. And each of the four major tissue types is subclassified into more specific tissue types. Our main focus of this lecture is just talking about the characteristics and functions of the tissues, and we'll talk a little bit about how they are subclassified. Right, so let's start talking about epithelial tissue. Well, this tissue consists almost entirely of cells. So there's very little of this extracellular material or matrix. Now, where would you find epithelial tissue? Well, it covers body surfaces and it forms these glands. So it forms the outer surface of the body. So the upper layer of our skin is this epithelial tissue. It also forms the internal linings of digestive, respiratory and urogenital tracts. It also forms the internal lining of the heart and blood vessels, and it also lines many of our body cavities. So when we look at epithelial tissue, we can see that epithelial cells that form the epithelial tissue have a free apical surface and an attached basal surface. So what does that mean? I've just drawn this little cartoon here with the blue arrow pointing to the apical surface. You can see it's not attached to anything. An epithelial tissue either faces the outside, like as in the skin, or the inside. So they have this free surface. For example, a blood vessel is a hollow tube and epithelial cells on the inside don't face anything. Then you can see that the basal surface is then connected to connective tissue, which holds them in place. So there's not much extracellular material at all, and these cells are held very tightly together, and that makes them really good barriers. They're also avascular, right? Remember that prefix A means without, so this means they don't contain blood vessels. So if you think about the top layer of the skin, which is epithelial tissue, there are blood vessels nearby and connective tissue, so nutrients can still be delivered and waste can be taken away by diffusion. And these tissues are continuously being replaced. So they're undergoing cell division via mitosis. So for example, in the digestive tract, that lining gets replaced over and over. And this is important because these cells are constantly exposed to chemicals. Same thing about the outer surface of the skin is continuously exposed to ultraviolet light. Okay, so let's have a talk a little bit about the functions of epithelia. So it has a protective role. So it protects underlying structures and acts as a great physical barrier. So for example, the skin. And you often find, when you brush against something, you're going to lose some cells that are dead. But the purpose of the skin, is to protect underlying tissues such as muscle tissue. We also have epithelia, which functions to regulate the passage of substances. So, for example, epithelial tissue will determine what passes through vessel walls. So these epithelial cells of the blood vessel are called endothelial cells, and they're usually held very tightly together. So they're going to direct the passage of substances through the blood vessel wall. Epithelia is also involved in secreting substances. So, for example, the pancreas, and the pancreas will secrete insulin and other hormones and also digestive enzymes. And epithelia is also involved in absorbing substances. So, for example, the lining of the small intestine has epithelial cells with finger-like projections which assist in absorbing nutrients from the digestive tract. So they're the functions, important to remember those. Okay, how do we classify epithelium? Well, it's classified based on the number of layers of cells and also on the shape of the top or the apical layer of cells. When there's only one layer of cells, it's called simple. If there are more than one layer of cells, so multiple layers of cells, it's called stratified. And then we also have this weird one which looks stratified, but it's actually one layer, and this is why it's called pseudostratified. When you look at it, because the cells are a funny shape, and because the nucleus is in a different place, you think there are multiple layers, but each cell is actually just connected to connective tissue. Okay, so we're going to have a look at those now. You can see this simple epithelium just with one layer of cells. We also have a stratified epithelium. You can see there's multiple layers of cells on top of each other. And then we have this pseudostratified epithelium. This one here has cilia, which you can see at the top, and it's found in the respiratory tract. Okay, and the cells produce mucus as well. Okay, we also have the shape of the top or the apical layer of cells, which also classifies the epithelium. So the shape might be flat or scale-like. In this case, it's called squamous epithelium, or it might be square or cube-shaped, so it's called cuboidal, and they're as wide as they are high. And then columnar, where it's column-shaped, where it's taller rather than wide. So you can see that here, very flat cells being those squamous cells. Then we have cuboidal cells, and then on the right there, those high, narrow, columnar epithelium. So when we're classifying epithelium, it will have one of the words simple or stratified, and then one of these words to describe the cell shape, so squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. So you might have simple squamous, or you might have stratified squamous, or whatever. So we're going to go through all of these in a minute, but we're also going to talk a little bit about transitional epithelium as well. This epithelium lines distensible organs, so those organs that stretch, and the example there is the urinary bladder, but also the stomach as well. When the bladder is empty, this epithelium sort of shrinks down, and it looks like there are multiple layers of cells. But when the bladder is full, it looks like there's only one layer of cells, and the shape changes from cuboidal to squamous. So let's have a look at that one. We might look at this one first, and then we'll go back, okay? So this is this transitional epithelium here. In the bladder, for example, when the tissue is not stretched, it looks like there's multiple layers of cells, and then as the bladder fills up, you can see that it looks like there's only one layer of cells, and that shape has changed from those box-like cells to being those flat ones. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, so I might just go back here. So we've talked about the number of layer of cells and the shape of the top apical layer of cells, which will classify the epithelium. So in terms of the functional characteristics of epithelial tissue types, firstly starting with simple epithelium. So one layer of cells, this will be found in areas that allow diffusion of gases, so say in the lungs, also filtration of blood, involved in secretion and absorption as well. We also have stratified, so this is multiple layers of cells, so they're going to be found in areas that are involved in protection, so protection to underlying tissues, particularly against abrasion. But because it's stratified, there's multiple layers of cells, so it's more difficult for things to move through stratified epithelium. We also have pseudostratified, which is mucus-secreting epithelium. We have transitional epithelium, which I just showed you, which allows hollow organs to stretch. We have squamous, so those flat cells in the apical layer, which will allow diffusion because they're very thin or flat, so gases could diffuse through those because there wouldn't be a long distance to diffuse. They also act as filters, and we have cuboidal and columnar epithelium as well, which allows secretion or absorption. So different epithelial cells have evolved in different tissues depending on their function. Now we're just going to fly through what this sort of looks like here. We have simple squamous epithelium, so just one layer of epithelial cells, and they're very flat. So you might find these in the lung alveoli, which is involved, in a diffusion of gases. So, oxygen needs to move through into the blood, and carbon dioxide needs to move out of the blood vessel and into the alveoli, and then back, exhaled into the air. We have simple cuboidal epithelium in some parts of the body here. We have these, you can just see again, just one layer of cube-shaped cells. We also have simple columnar epithelium. So these are cells producing mucus. So these goblet cells producing mucus. And then we also have stratified squamous epithelium. You can see all those multiple layers of cells, and then the top layer of cells is squamous. So you can see that there very easily. You've got the multiple layer of cells, and then the very top layer is squamous. So that's called stratified squamous epithelium, and you'd find that in the skin. Okay, we also have stratified stratified cuboidal epithelium, where there's multiple layers of those box-like or cube-shaped epithelial cells. And then we have stratified columnar epithelium, and again you can see there's multiple layers of cells, and the top layer or the apical layer, they're columnar in shape. And then finally we have that pseudostratified columnar epithelium, where you look at it and you think it's multiple layers of cells, but when you look really close you can see that there's only one layer of cells, and each cell is attached to the basement membrane. It's just that they're a bit irregular in shape, and the nuclei are located in different places. That sort of it can be a little bit confusing until you look close at them. Okay, and we've already spoken about transitional epithelium. So epithelial tissue can also make glands, and that means they're just specialized to secrete fluids. So an epithelial gland produces fluid and releases it from the cells into the extracellular fluid. Now, epithelial glands can be just one epithelial cell or can be formed by an infolding in epithelial tissue. There are two types of epithelial glands. First one is endocrine glands. Endocrine glands themselves have no open contact with exterior surfaces or ducts. So their secretion will be directly into the extracellular fluid. An example, endocrine glands will secrete hormones, which can then enter the circulation or the bloodstream. And exocrine glands then will secrete their product onto exterior surfaces. So say sweat glands, as an example, will secrete sweat onto the surface of the body. Another example is a mucus gland. So here the mucus will be secreted into a tract. Okay, so these exocrine glands either secrete directly, onto the skin, surface of the skin, as with the sweat glands, or via these ducts or tubes. An example of that being those mucus glands. Okay, so here we're just looking at a diagram that's showing you all these weird and wonderful looking glands. You can see right at the top, this is just a single gland cell in the epithelium. You can also get like these simple straight tubular ones, or you could get simple branched tubular, or they might coil, and so on and so forth, or they become sort of compound and tubular, and sometimes they form these little acini that we might find in mammary glands, and also other shapes. You don't need to remember any of these little diagrams. It's just to give you an idea. So you can see there's a single cell that just forms a gland, or all those other ones where the epithelial tissue is folding down to form glands, and sometimes they branch or they twist or they expand towards the bottom, and that gives you those sort of bulby looking structures. And the function of those infoldings is to create a cavity, and then substances can be released into those cavities. So I'm going to leave you with these two questions here to reflect upon, and we're going to go through them when we have the tutorial on this tissues topic. So firstly, which of the following functions would you expect stratified squamous epithelium to perform? So would it be gas exchange in the lungs, or mucus secretion, absorption, contraction, or none of the above? And then just thinking to yourself, can you list the four main types of tissues, and which of them often consists more of extracellular material than cells? So that finishes this little short recording on epithelial tissue. I'll come back in a while and I'm going to talk about connective tissue.